Hi, I'm Ryan.
Hi, I'm Jess, and you're listening to Your Therapist Is Not Okay.
On today's episode, we're going to respond to some listener requests to talk about internalized homophobia. We're going to dive right into what we mean by that, and how it shows up in our lives, and what we might do about it in therapy.
Stay tuned. This topic has been a really important one for Ryan and I, most because of our identities, but also because of our work. And so when two separate listeners asked us to do this podcast, it felt like it was time for us to address a really important topic that maybe we don't actually speak about enough. So, when we're talking about this term, internalized homophobia, Ryan, over to you. What does it usually mean?
Yeah, so essentially, we're talking about a situation where the homophobia that's present in the larger world, that's present now, or maybe the ways it was present when you were younger, both kind of ends up getting integrated into feelings of guilt or shame or needing to hide, even when you're not necessarily having an external influence that's telling you to do so, right? Maybe you are out, and for all intents and purposes, you are portraying yourself as, a very proud person. And sometimes inside, you might not feel that pride, or you might feel like that pride is a front you're putting up. A lot of complicated feelings come up with that. And there is, I think, some grief that can be in there as well. Depending on the amount of time that we're in the closet, or maybe when we kind of internally come to terms with, like, oh, I think I am gay, bi, a lesbian, etc. Um, there's a loss of a whole potential life that we imagined, right? A whole heteronormal life where we did the kind of typical stuff that's expected within our culture. And many of those things you can absolutely still do regardless of your identity, but they kind of have like this different feeling to them. And not every queer person necessarily wants to do those things, but we are still raised, kind of taught that you're supposed to make a family
Hmm.
with a long-term partner of the opposite biological sex, and you're supposed to produce and raise children, do tons of stuff with your family all the time, be successful in business, kind of fall into, we've talked about before, the symbolic order that says basically these are the things that are expected in this society to be, quote, good or not a problem. Sometimes your religious or other belief structures might come into that as well, right? So for a lot of folks, they might have been told during religious classes as a kid or later as an adult that being gay is a sin, or being gay isn't something that we, this community, do.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Lacan talked about and wrote about the symbolic order. What Lacan says is that no matter where we are in the world, we're born into a system of beliefs, expectations, and social conditions that tell us what it means to be a good human, to be a successful human, to basically fit in and belong. And what happens is that when you are not part of those systems that are set up in place to make you successful or to make you belong, those can create a lasting impact on like who you are, your self-worth, and your identity. And we're going to be talking about the Western world right now, just so we can stay within our kind of milieu, our world. But this is everywhere, and it just is very different no matter where you live, but they're always present. And I think, especially in the Western world, we have certain very um, very stringent identities on what how we're supposed to look, who we're supposed to date, and how we are supposed to present ourselves. And I think what you're talking about points at all of those that being gay or bi or lesbian or trans fit away from those structures.
Yeah. And when I think about some of the most kind of fundamental structures of the symbolic order we're grappling with here in the West,
Mhm.
a lot of that, whether it's about gender or sexuality, comes from gender-based expectations in our society and in childhood. This is
Yeah.
kind of the root of what is, it's not pretty common to talk about toxic masculinity. It's a term most
Hmm.
folks know. That's basically about this idea that boys and men, I don't know, do sports, are muscular, are strong, are independent, are don't need help, etc. Fill in the blanks. We've all had
Yes.
slightly different experiences of it, but you're getting the gist of like this is what boys and men are supposed to do. They're not supposed to be soft. They're not supposed to be um, asking for help. They're not supposed to be focusing on creative pursuits. And that is something that many people internalize. Maybe even, and we'll talk about this as well, like if they're gay and they're out and they're living a gay life, there are still elements of that toxic masculinity that can show up.
Yeah. And a fear that you're not necessarily buying in. Um, I think you and I both know that violence can happen when you don't fit into these norms. You can be a target for other people's vitriol and hatred because you're not fitting into what society has deemed makes you male enough.
Mm. I guess I can speak to that kind of like maybe other queer folks experience this, but I especially if you were raised to be a boy or a man, this little voice in my head sometimes when I'm really, I don't know, camping it up or something that's like, okay, tone it down.
Mm,
Like you're being a little bit too much. So with any kind of version of breaking these norms, there can be a too much or not enoughness that can really
mm.
come into it. And
Yeah,
on the other side of the kind of the coin, there's also expectations around femininity.
yeah. And being able to look apart. It's unfortunate that saying the ideal body, quite
Mm,
a vague term, and anyone listening will know exactly what I mean. There, and that's social conditioning. It's a great example of it. I don't have to say thin. I don't have to say tall. I don't have to mention like what your hair is doing or any of those things. You just know how you're supposed to buy in. And lesbophobia would mean that you might be lesbian, but why are you being butch? Why are you trying to be manly? Why are you a tomboy? Unless you're a sexualized being, different podcast, but very interesting topic, then you're not necessarily buying into that motif. And these things can actually allow us to not only feel like we're too much, it's one of the worst things people say, Ryan. Like, I feel like I'm too
mm,
much. And what you said is exactly that. Like, I'm allowing myself to just take up so much space because I'm having a good time that I fear being stamped down. Or I
mm,
feel that someone will want that, that I'm exceeding the bounds in which I'm allowed to exist and take up space and have fun, be loud. And so all of these expectations can come in to create phobias. And we wanted to take up a lot of space in this podcast, to also talk about biphobia and transphobia and intersectionality to be able to, and we will be in this podcast, being able to show the ways in which we've been conditioned to live can come up as a way that we don't feel like we fit in enough or we're good enough. We compensate for these in many ways. You were talking actually, Ryan, about being a good gay.
mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's that really like, yeah, don't be too gay, don't be too unconventional, don't be too feminine. And this, like the internalized part really shows up when you take a look at the gay community itself too, right? Like if you are wanting to be successful in pulling at the club or on the apps or whatever, if you're looking for a partner or something more casual, there's a lot of people that want to know if you're masculine or feminine.
Mm.
And there are lots of people who are, trying intentionally to work against their internalized homophobia. And yet you will notice that the people that are going to be more successful at the club are going to be more masculine in
Yeah.
appearance and in demeanor. Um, and so that is almost a self-policing kind of thing that we do, as we've talked about in other podcasts where we've kind of talked about. societal expectations, we really take those in and we do them to ourselves and those around us.
Yeah.
Sometimes that feeling that queer people might get, that I know I've gotten before when I see someone who's just really taking up a lot of space, being super queer, I feel that sometimes initial like, ugh,
Hmm.
on their behalf. And I have to remind myself that, like, okay, that's something about me. I can let them do their thing and support them and actually process for myself, like, why am I having this ick moment? And sometimes that ick moment might mean then that people don't approach them. Not
Hmm.
everyone is a batshit crazy therapist like me that is like, oh, how am I projecting my problems in this exact moment? Uh,
Yeah, sure.
right? A lot of people are just going to act based on
Mhm.
that gut instinct because that's really what humans do. We act on our gut things, and I, along with everybody else, fall into behavior patterns all the time too.
Absolutely. And even in like, I'm thinking about when you talk about good gay with men,
Mhm.
with a lot of my gay clients that are navigating this, they've probably had a parental figure say, okay, I get that you're gay, but you know what? You're not like one of those feminine gays. Like they'll
Mhm.
be able to even destroy a sense of freedom in a compliment that actually is quite backhanded and misogynist.
Mm. I think a really readily visible way that sometimes comes up is if folks have ever watched RuPaul's Drag Race. It's not
Mm.
uncommon for there to be contestants on there that are out and gay, but not really feeling like them being a drag queen, which is a very kind of breaking homophobia in every way. Like it's very loudly gay. It's very taking up space. It's very femininity. It's a big performance of rejecting norms. It's beautiful.
Mhm.
And some performers are like, well, my family supports me being gay, but like they don't really get the drag thing. Right? So there can be this kind of thing about like levels of don't be too gay or keep that away from us. There can be that kind of like I'm fine with people being gay, but I don't want them to rub it in my face. Well, what's rubbing it in your face? Holding hands? Kissing?
Mhm.
Like those are things that would be normal for any heterosexual couple to do. So why is that rubbing it in your face? Um, but we see also like that queer folks self-police as well of like, oh, I don't know if I'm safe to hold hands here. And that's that fear of homophobia. But then there also are people that might say like, I don't want to be one of those gays. I don't want to be aggressive about it or something like that. And I will say that there's a part of us that wants to fit into the norms. That's how we first got praise growing up, is often when we achieve the things that we're supposed to achieve. Um, and this is not very much not to say that this is a blanket exact same experience for everyone. There are lots of people who have different experiences of this. And that, is part of where that intersectionality comes in, right? Like your experience of being, my experience of being a white queer person and a person of color's experience of being queer are going to be very different. Because there's some different symbolic orders at play, right? There might be different family and cultural expectations, etc. So yeah, that we want to keep getting that praise. We want to keep doing that thing that we're supposed to do.
And that self-policing can happen in any community, everywhere, because of those symbolic orders. The problem is that the symbolic order is already telling you you're not good enough. And in that sense, just to flip what you're saying, there's also a sense that we also want to show people rather than tell who we are, which can also feel like we're made to fit into this um basically
Mold.
schema mold, yeah, schema mold that we are this person. And we'll see this a lot with dress. We'll see it a lot with how we have affect. When we look at somebody, we immediately decide who they are. And this can make us feel like a pressure to then conform to certain values that our community might have for us that we can then fit here. And so not only do we not fit in the wider symbolic order that actually can really make us feel like we're not enough, we then might turn and try to fit within a community that feels like it could be open to us and face a huge other part of this expectation? Are you gay enough or are you masc enough? Am I the right kind of lesbian? Am I going to be like non-binary as a one? Am I passing? How am I navigating this? All of these expectations now are hitting at both sides. And it can be hard to feel free when you have all of these expectations. If I'm not fitting into this heteronormative expectation, can I fit into this LGBTQI expectation?
Hmm.
There's a lot of pressure there. And if you don't fit in either one, the huge question can be, where do I belong? Am I good enough?
Absolutely. Yeah. And, different people will have, kind of like I was saying before, based on when and where they grew up, different forms of homophobia that they experienced and internalized homophobia that they're grappling with. And we can often see as people mature and come to like understand their own experiences that they start to come to grips with, oh wait, I just clocked that growing up, like I was told over and over, like boys don't play with dolls, or
Mm.
girls are supposed to be nice. Um, Things like that that kind of reiterate that. Where we might also hear pretty often now, we were talking about before the episode, some people saying like, "Oh, coming out was fine for me, not a big deal.
Mm.
Like I don't worry about that."
Mhm.
Or I don't feel like we have homophobia like we used to. And there are ways in which homophobia has changed. In some countries, some rights have been gained. Also, some things are getting rolled back right now.
Oh,
So, like,
yeah.
this is still an ongoing thing. And there's something in that needing to say coming out was fine suggests that it might not have been fine. It suggests that you thought about it and you were worried about it. I'm glad it went fine and that you felt supported. I really
Yeah.
I wish it the same for everyone. But that that it might have not.
At the same time, because you're saying it, kind of can also allow yourself to maybe silence somebody else where it didn't come fine, or make it seem like coming out is a necessary thing that you should just do. Why haven't you done it yet?
Mm,
There's a lot of ways in which the way we police language or police others now within the community can also create this silence that if yours was fine, is internalized homophobia still a thing? Yes. And I think what you're pointing to is language. This
mhm.
idea of safety is a really important one. We talk about safe places. Oh, that's an amazing place for vacation because it's super safe. I can just be myself. That immediately indicates that it could have gone the other way. And when we talk this way and don't realize what we're saying, it can create a veneer of silence that we don't necessarily know what to do with.
Absolutely. That makes it hard to kind of know how to speak out and share that we're having a challenging experience. And there can be this kind of um, internal shame that we feel about feeling ashamed,
Yes.
right? Like there's this kind of, I sometimes refer to it as a double shame. And as a like parallel example, a lot of folks that are maybe trying to change something with their body might experience this, where they're
Hmm.
feeling shame because they're not comfortable with how their body is and they've been told by society their body is wrong. But they may also feel shame for dieting because you've also been told that you're supposed to love yourself the way you are.
Yep.
And so that you get that with homophobia, where you have the internalized homophobia and you also have the performance of pride, where
Yep.
you're supposed to be out and proud and loud and etc. And sometimes, as we've talked about in a video series on Considered Self's website, there's a lot of complexity in pride. It's not
Yeah.
an easy thing for everyone. It's not a fun thing for everyone. There is still shaming. There is still um, expectations and people who are excluded or not encouraged to attend. So it's not, pride is not a simple thing, whether it's about feeling proud or the events of pride that show up in June mostly.
I think if you want to check out that video series, you'll have a lot of videos of Ryan and I grappling with this. And I should flag that we're going to be doing a podcast specifically for Pride and talking about some of the very things we do in our video series. especially when it
Mhm.
comes to body dysmorphia, how we want to celebrate. What does it mean to be in the closet during Pride? If you're interested in any of these topics, we'll link it in our bio, but we've been doing this series for years. And so pride can be a really tricky one. And what you're saying, Ryan, that I think is really interesting is this double shame comes when you feel like you shouldn't feel ashamed anymore, or you've
Mhm.
done this huge task, let's say, of coming out, and you should now be done. The big hurdle has been overcome. But I'm out with my partner, and I don't want necessarily someone to know that we are a couple. What's going on in me? And then we can have this war going on in our head where we're battling something that we can't talk about right now. I'm supposed to be having a good time. I'm supposed to feel comfortable. I'm supposed to be celebrating. I'm supposed to be tough. That
Mhm.
battle can be exhausting.
Absolutely. And that, I mean, really helps us transition into ways that we might kind of compensate for our internalized homophobia, or the kind of maybe the more visible or obvious ways in which we're trying to be either gay enough or not too gay. Right. And there's this tightrope in between that's kind of the socially expected gayness. And depending on the kind of social setting you're in, that tightrope might shift. Right. I might be supposed to be like a little bit gayer when I'm out with my friends, and a little bit more traditional, a little bit more demure when I'm at work or in the board meeting or something like that. So we might even hear or think things like, yeah, I'm gay, but like I have a long-term partner who I'm monogamous with, or I'm really successful in my jobs. Like, that kind of compensates for me being gay, or having a home and being, successful in your comfort, um, having a great body that like allows you to kind of feel like a good person still. Almost like these things could provide us the right way to be queer and or balance out the badness of our queerness.
There's a really good book called Velvet Rage that take it with a grain of salt. It was written a while ago. It was written in 2006, but it talks exactly about the compensation that we might do to show our worth and to show our value. And we then grab all these other things in the symbolic order that we can do. I can get rich. I can be the successful person in my company. I can then get enough money to buy a home or a condo. I can seek out the gym membership and get a great body. These are things I can do even if I'm failing at this other thing.
Hmm.
This compensation adds a lot of pressure that we don't often recognize as being compensation as such. We don't often think about the I'm gay, but.
Hmm.
And if you want to check out the book, it is a really interesting take on that based on other people's experiences. Also, we'll talk about abandonment and things like that. Again, take it with a grain of salt. It's not recent, so it'll have some things that I believe are outdated, but it can point to some of these things if you're interested.
Yeah, I think that that's a really interesting point that you're making there, and that like that definitely is something that shows up. I notice it in myself, where wanting to be successful in my career, or wanting to be published, and trying to
Mm.
maybe find my worth in those other things, even though I may still be feeling shame around my gender or sexuality. Um,
Mhm.
and I guess that's something that I very much see in maybe someone wanting to take pride in being successful at being kind of part of a certain subgroup within the gay community, of like I can find pride in that, like I fit in somewhere.
Mm.
And so I think a lot of these things that you're talking about, or that are explored in Velvet Rage, are about finding a way in which I still can fit into society, or still fit into a group.
Yeah.
Um, and that way I am not alone. I'm not bad.
And maybe we don't even recognize that those are maybe some of our motivations, that they're actually based on internalized shame or not feeling good enough, that we might then try to like be good enough here. Getting a PhD, for example, right? Like being, I might try for schooling, but I'm going to do the best I can do for schooling.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And there's a disproportionate number of queer people have advanced degrees. So there
Mm,
is definitely some of that, like, okay, here's a place that I am feel safe, can be successful, and
mm,
maybe in some cases I'm allowed to be myself, allowed to be queer because they're often a little bit more progressive spaces.
mm,
And I guess that as we were talking about this, I'm thinking like all of this is not to say that there's anything wrong with finding a place where you feel successful and fit in. That's fine. Where I start to sometimes worry about folks or myself is when I notice that I'm using that to kind of double down on a hate for myself. Or
yeah.
when I'm like, oh, that's the only thing I have to cling to is my PhD. So that if then that comes under fire because I'm struggling to finish my Viva or I get corrections,
Yep.
whatever it may be, that then I'm like, I've lost the one thing that I had that made me okay
Yes.
to myself and the world.
A lot hinges on that because it's identity and not just something I'm pursuing.
Right. And then it can become like, oh, I've become the thing that I feared. I'm a
Mm.
failure and I'm gay.
And I think that the other part that it can be tricky is that benchmark can often move.
Mm,
That we might achieve this goal and it's not good enough. It wasn't the next goal. We don't get to celebrate because that shame might still be there, that I don't get to have celebration. I don't get to bask. I need to keep achieving.
that's a really good point. I mean, even think about that kind of education example that you brought up of like, I didn't, when I was 17, 18, I knew I wanted to go to college. But I didn't know that I was going to or even wanted to get a PhD. But by the time I finished my undergrad, I was like, well, it's not really that impressive of a degree. I moved the benchmark.
Yep.
Even though it's a huge thing to get any
Yeah.
degree, to
Yes.
get any certificate, to get any weekend class, and like that's enough. That's
Mm,
amazing. But yeah, to be wary of like, how do I keep moving the goalpost? I want to have a good job. I want to make
mm.
or not three figures. That's not good at all. Six figures. I make
You
$999 a year.
but I'm happy.
Oh, I want to make six figures, or I want to make partner at the firm, or I want to be able to buy a, fancy house in a major city.
Mm.
It keeps moving.
Well, my friend just got this promotion. I didn't get a promotion. All of those ways we
Mm,
socially compare as well.
mm,
Yeah. And these are also the symbolic orders that heteronormative culture will play into. So they're everywhere. They can seem in the air we breathe, but what we're talking about is what's happening for your reason why here.
mm.
And we're linking that with shame. I'm really curious about that because we're talking a lot about how people fit.
Yeah.
But what about the invisibility? I think when we're talking about homophobia, lesbophobia, it's all about like how they show up. But I'm wondering about biphobia,
Mm,
panphobia, some of these ways in which we might actually not get to show up, um, especially if you're straight passing. It can
yeah.
feel like none of these things are for you. That you could have chosen differently, but you fell in love with someone that, by all society standards, you don't really fit this community. And
Right.
that can have its own phobia, where instead of thinking I'm not enough in the sense that, like, I've chosen this different path, I'm not enough because I'm not fitting at all in how I identify. And I don't want to because I've fallen in love with someone that's straight passing, let's say. Let's use that as an example. But now where do I fall? I
Mhm.
don't fit within the straight community, but now I don't really fit within the gay community. Where do I go into that? That kind of invisibility is another level of phobia.
Yeah. Yeah, in fact, I'm thinking as you're saying that there's maybe a parallel I won't spend too much time on, but like to being an inside and outside person within any culture that I hear a lot from maybe like first generation descendants of immigrants who are like, well, I don't really feel like I would fit in if I went to where my parents were from, and also I'm often not made to feel like I fit in here.
Hmm.
So it's that kind of like I don't feel fully at home in any place or fully accepted in any place.
Hmm.
And And then so I think that thinking about that performance, thinking about the Velvet Rage with biphobia, for some folks, performing straight can almost be the way to say like, I'm still okay. And for
Yeah.
other folks, it feels very erasing. Like, well, but I'm still bi and I still feel attraction. I still have desire, you know? And I've still have had that kind of, I think that experience of reflection when
Mm,
you're growing up about what is my identity and who am I, that is part of what kind of influences and creates the queer community. We've all have that shared experience
yeah.
that sometimes if you're heterosexual and you kind of fit the mold in a lot of ways, especially if you're like a straight white cis man, you're not forced to contemplate your place in society quite so much. And not none of that is to rag on straight cis white men. You're born the way you're born,
Yep.
but there is a little bit less pressure.
And that introspection of like, but when we talk about social policing, I think to say I'm gay, you have your sexuality's there, right? We know who you're going to partner up with.
Mm,
And when that complexity's there with pan or with bi, with trans as well, you don't necessarily know how to fit this person. Where
mhm.
are you? And so they can say, but you're dating a man. And so that but can also become very gaslighting of like, how do I fit? I want to go to this event or I want to celebrate Pride. A lot of these events are binary or I don't want to feel like I'm out of place. And so that shame can actually come from within the community. Whereas outside the community, people might celebrate your straightness and you can feel like, well, you don't really see me either. Or your friends might be like, well, you're our straight friend. You're like, okay, so how do I constantly have to re-identify every time? Like that feels like a constant coming out, which is again exhausting. And so you might compensate by dressing differently, like having a different kind of haircut, shaving side of your head. You might
Mhm.
dress like more kind of edgy. You might start trying to prove something to yourself. And the question that can come with that is, I mean, that's lovely if that's really what you want, but are we compensating because we feel erased?
There is almost that kind of element of when you share that with someone that you are bi or any identity that's not visible, which in for some folks, even just being gay is not visible. If you're not sitting there with a partner,
Yeah, yeah.
it may not be clear that you're gay. There's this kind of show me, prove it.
Prove it. Yeah.
But I mean, I really like the counter movement to that. That's just like what you've said is enough, right? Like we
Mm.
can just accept what people say about themselves. They
Hmm.
don't have to prove it. And I think about this links right in with um, transphobia,
Yes,
um,
it does.
whether someone's gender expansive and the sense of wanting to transition genders or being non-binary or being kind of gender fluid and that shifts over periods of time, um, where we're expected to pass, right? If someone is a trans man, like you're supposed to be masculine and butch and like
Mm.
appear maybe a certain way. Also for trans women, it's supposed to be feminine and pretty, right? We celebrate pretty trans people. But you know
Hmm.
what? Anybody can be ugly. Why can't we celebrate anybody?
That's so affirming, Ryan.
Yeah.
Anyone can be ugly.
One can be ugly. What I just mean is like you shouldn't have to be a certain way to be able to substantiate your identity. And that a big thing I guess that I experience personally is like I don't necessarily owe anyone androgyny. And I
No.
have that sometimes that little voice in my head that is very much like you just look like we've joked on here before. You just look like a coach. You look like you're gonna go run a little league game, or I'll have a little voice sometimes when I'm leaving the house and I forgot to put on an earring. I love
Yeah.
wearing earrings. Sometimes it's inconvenient, or I just forget, or I'm in a hurry or something, and then I'm kind of thinking like, will anyone know that I'm queer? Now,
Mm.
it's very likely that people are going to know that I'm not straight, but I like people to kind of clock that I might not be gender normal either. So the nails and earrings and things like that feel very affirming to me because they're a way to kind of shout that. And there are ways in which this performance is potentially affirming and self-loving. but still that feeling of prove it doesn't feel good.
No, especially because it's already proven. But maybe when we're trying to prove it to others, we're also trying to prove something to ourselves that I'm here. And so you can even see how these symbolic orders shift depending on where we are and how we then have these very strict rules of how we get to show up. And I think what you're saying too is it needs to make sense. I can't say something and you can't have it be seen immediately. And then there's the proving it. So basically, these symbolic orders are now about proving it. Oh, here I'm putting my money where my mouth is. And
Hmm.
it's identity. It's internal. It's who we are. And when we're self-policing like this, that's another part of internalized shame, hatred, self-worth that we are trying to act so that we're okay.
Hmm. Absolutely. As you were speaking about that, I was thinking about that show, Fellow Travelers. We watched it together. Really
Yeah, we
great
did.
show. I rewatched it recently with Griffith, with my partner. And I guess I'm thinking about the way the symbolic order and performance of gender and norms shows up, and the way it also changes through time, where, one of the main characters is constantly grappling with feeling very ashamed for being gay
Yep.
in ways that he enacts that very much shame other queer people or insist that other people stay in the closet or, choose a kind of secret lifestyle where they can live out some of their desires and fantasies, but not be too gay or never be clocked.
Hmm.
But just as I'm thinking about clients that I've worked with and clients that I may work with in the future that are going to be carrying that baggage of older forms of the symbolic order as well. And they don't go away. They're still in you.
I think that's exactly the point that, like, if we think about that show, that character who was very powerful, very masculine, was both drawn to and repelled by this man that he was in love with. That was kind of just wanted to also grappling with his own stuff, but also free
Hmm.
and living to his ethics and ideologies. And that is a really interesting example of like how we can kind of like ride up against one another as we're trying to grapple with ourselves. We look to other people to see where we belong. That is just a natural human thing. And that's kind of where we get social comparisons from. How well are you doing? But also this aspect of how do you see me? Can I belong here? It's very easy for us to feel like we belong when we're playing it safe. But when we're not, can we still belong? And I think that that kind of part, I was about to say when we're alone, can we feel safe? And I
Mm.
actually think this is where therapy is really important because I think actually it's when we're alone, we might not feel safe. It might be when we're alone that these voices can become quite loud, especially if we're falling in line with all the other things that we've strived for, maybe are successful in. That
Mhm.
maybe that voice when we're alone in our head can make us feel like we're not enough. We need to do more. And bringing that to the therapy room basically means that I'm breaking away from trying to fit into society right now to try to grapple with all the ways that this has impacted me inside.
Yeah, absolutely. And there will never be a time that a client kind of shows or says that they're grappling with this internalized homophobia that will not really touch something in me where I'm usually going to feel a little teary at first, whether or not that's visible to the client. Is it hits such a deep part in me that's just like, oh, Queen,
Yeah.
it hurts. And I felt that when I was looking at some of the DMs that we got about this that kind of prompted us that like now's the time that we need to do this episode.
Yeah.
Um, it's a deep hurt, especially because we keep doing it to ourselves over and over again.
Yeah. And it's often very early linked.
Hmm.
Like one of the things that you and I do within psychodynamics is we go right to the root. We go right back in time. We start to look at the ways in which these internal voices now probably were pretty external voices back then. What are we replaying? What are we trying to compensate for, fix? How are we still allowing the weight of those past comments to kind of take over us now? That back in time work is really, really tricky and painful and can be quite brutal to navigate. But once we start to see where some of these external voices, maybe some of the things that it's not uncommon to hear someone say, I prayed I wasn't this way. Or I would look in the mirror and say, don't be, like, fake it. Like, to hear those voices, to go back to those children and to
Mm.
actually tend to them is an incredibly harrowing process, but also very powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And some of that is going to be talking about what we call conditions of worth, which were basically those symbolic order things that we were told by some authority figure, often parents, that were like, don't be this, don't do that. There are the ways where actually a client said it to me perfectly. The ways that we're taught to earn love. To be worthy of love, I have to be X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
I have to be strong. I have to be pretty. I have to be normal.
And I think that's exactly where your idea of not being too much also comes from.
Right.
I think a lot of times we say, I don't want to be too much. I don't want to take up this space. It comes from those conditions of worth. What were we told? And then how did we get love from that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And a lot of these things, even if we're working with a therapist to shift them in ourselves and to come to a deeper understanding, the outside world is not going to change on our terms quickly, right? We
No.
can we can create change in our communities, we can create change in the world, but it's not quick and it's not always going to work out the way we hope. And the same is true like within our families, right? So we might work on how we want to combat those conditions of worth internally and maybe value some different things about ourselves. But that doesn't mean that when we go home for a holiday that we're still not going to be confronted with like, oh, you're wearing pink.
Hmm. Oh,
Oh,
yeah.
you like I just heard like this last holiday season, I heard, oh, you have the gay green phone. I was like,
Wow.
mint green. I mean, it's not, if that's gay for you, then I weep for your color choices in life.
You are like really holding yourself back from like your decor.
But like these things will keep coming.
That is a huge thing that I will to navigate is that like we might be doing all this self-worth stuff, and we'll talk about that in a second, like all this self-worth stuff in session.
Mm.
But when you leave the door, part of the work is also like, how do I navigate keeping myself safe here? And what would I say to that when it actually breaches a boundary? And it might be that if that is your definition of a gay color, then like, God help you.
And there might be, learning to navigate too for ourselves where I'll have times when I'm deciding like, do I want to give someone a sass back because that was a stupid thing to say? Or do I want to just ignore it because it's not worth my peace?
Yeah.
And there can be a performativity and a judgment in that too, where I'm like, wow, if I'm being the gay that I should be, then
Mm.
I would always shout it down. But sometimes it's not worth it to me. So you have to decide, and therapy can be a great place to go to kind of process the decision you've made and does it feel right? Am I happy with it? Do I want to do something different next time? Do I celebrate the decision that I made because it's a sign of progress? Um,
Yes.
yeah.
Sometimes deciding to just rest a bit and not feel pressure everywhere can be a celebration in the office.
Hmm.
Politics, philosophy, order, for example, is a very philosophical term. Like these things come in to our narrations of self. And just because we may not know a term doesn't mean it's not impacting us. It's just something that is like basically looking at society and saying, here's how I'm going to label this phenomenon.
Hmm.
And therapy is a great place to start to dissect some of these things because that depth of awareness can also give a level of control. This is what's happening here. I'm now understanding this. I'm getting to the root of some of my reasons that are maybe outside of myself and also shaping my family and everyone else's, the reasons for the responses. It can give us control. It can also allow us to understand the complexities that can then allow us to resist and to re-narrate something that might feel more correct for ourselves. Linking this with the erasure that a lot of bi folk might have can be, why would identity need to be immediately something that's proven? Let's talk about where provenness comes from. How can we be
Mm.
instead of prove? And that's a really tough conversation to have. That's not going to be overnight. That's not in a 50-minute session. You're one and done. But it is something that we can start to challenge and resist and fight back at. So when someone does say, "Oh, but you're dating somebody of the opposite sex or gender," you can say, "Why would that matter?"
Right.
And so those things can be an act of power.
Hmm. I do think so much of, helping the work of therapy transition into everyday life is learning the pause. That it actually only takes maybe a second. Sometimes it feels like a lot longer than that, but just to give things a little bit of space because we've been able to talk around them and breathe life into them so much that if you're then having this conversation with someone and they say like, "Oh, but you're with Steve," then you can pause and think, there's something I want to say to this, and I know what it is, and I've maybe even practiced it in therapy, and then
Hmm.
I can say like something that's maybe very simple, but we just need a little air to say like, what about it?
Hmm.
Could you explain to me why that was important to say right now?
Mm.
And kind of be able to flip the script because there's a lot of things in the symbolic order that if people are forced to say out loud, they recognize that it doesn't align with their values, so they don't want to say it. You can have some fun with this if you're in a safe enough environment. It's one of my
Yeah.
favorite things to do actually with like something that's shaming an oppressed group, if it's shaming people of color, something like that. Someone makes a joke about an oppressed population, then you can be like, "Oh, could you tell me why that's funny?" Their expression is going to be worth millions of dollars to you.
I love that. Yeah, yeah. I think what you're saying there, that idea of power, can then start to be the catalyst that might allow us to start to re-narrate what worth looks like. And maybe instead of all these external things, as you and I were talking about, what are some of the internal celebrations of self? What does it mean to actually celebrate who we are, not just what we do? And that can feel incredibly profound. And it might just be inside the office for right now. And that's enough. For right now, that can be enough. So often we want to win all the time of like being able to just have this broad sweep of what our own success in therapy can look like. But at the same time, those little wins of just saying, like, I'm actually really proud of who I am. I'm actually really proud right now. And just taking pause of that and allowing that to sink in can be a really interesting and profound moment for us.
Mm, absolutely. Yeah. And to start to build that internal sense of self-worth that is not dependent on proving it, right? That you're saying there. And I think that there's a couple of things that come to my mind that I think speak to some of the DMs that we've gotten that were about like, well, what about this? What is this pride thing and things like that, where I'm also thinking like about some adages. This one comes from Drag Race, where someone says like if someone makes fun of you, you take that word, you put it on a shirt, and you make them eat it. Like you kind of reclaim it, um, and in that reclaiming, might not feel right to everyone. not
Mm,
everyone might really feel like I want to reclaim that and I'm really ready to. There are words that have been reclaimed that aren't reclaimed for me. There are some that I've just actually come to terms with more in the last year or so, even though I've been kind of processing this stuff for decades now. So it's not a linear route. You don't have to be ready to reclaim something. You're
mm,
allowed to kind of have your own boundaries and limits around that.
mm.
And I do think that pride for queer people, it doesn't just come in the sense of I'm good and I'm great. For
Yep.
me, it's actually is steeped in survival and pain.
Mhm.
I'm not only proud of being queer because I think I'm great, even though I do most of the time. Um, it also comes from knowing that people like me and me have survived and come through incredible odds. When I, read history or watch media or reflect on the way things were when I was a teenager,
Yep.
um, on the things that I did and said about myself,
Mhm.
to have survived that and be here living authentically in spite of it is where my pride comes from. So it feels like a little bit of a slightly different route to pride
Yeah.
that queer people have, that can be, for me, a healthy balance of pride and spite. Of like, I'm still here, fuck you.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
That kind of rings true with pride, right? It often We'll often hear the term pride was a protest, not just a celebration. It kind of turns into that when we think about identity. It can
Right.
also be pride is resilience and strength and coming through shit. It's not just toxic positivity that I'm great. Because you might not feel that way and it might really miss who you are.
Hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Um, and that feels like maybe my takeaway for this is to find your own route to pride that feels loving to yourself and that it's okay if you're not there. It's okay if you've been trying to get there for months or years or decades. It's not an easy thing. And I do think that having really supportive community or having a great therapist are things that can kind of help to walk you through this.
Mhm. And we're proud of you for the process. If this is something you're navigating, for those who asked the question, thank you. This is an incredibly important topic and often one that can, as we talked about before, feel silenced. For everyone who's listened, thank you so much for taking the time. It was a long one, but I think that when Ryan and I were planning it, we didn't want to just kind of go through the basics. We wanted to dive into this topic to do it justice for the two people that asked.
Yeah.
Um, as always, keep asking your questions. We love grappling with it. And thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, check out our others. And stay tuned for even more episodes coming up.
Follow us and leave a review on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And please tell your friends.
You can also follow us on Instagram too at Your Therapist Is Not Okay. Also, if you have any questions that you want us to answer, send us a DM there. We would love to answer your questions. And a lot of our topics come from listeners just like you.